I'm Dwayne Schultes. Welcome to this Vital Health podcast. Today I'm speaking to Michael Penn. He's the U.S. Head of Reimbursement and Public Policy at Sanofi. Michael, it's great to see you.
It's great to be here, Dwayne.
Well, I have to say, it's been a long time coming. We've been working on a project together.
Yeah.
But you've recently joined Sanofi. You've been in the industry for 20 years. We're here at ASCO. Obviously, it's very exciting. How would ASCO have been 20 years ago?
Oh, well, I think that overall, ASCO has changed quite a bit because I think with new innovation, I think the industry itself has changed just because of all the changes that have come through governmental intervention. That's probably a good place to start. But at the same time, I think through market consolidation and a variety of other factors, our industry has been able to adapt to a new environment, and we're trying to navigate the somewhat rough waters that we're facing.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned this. Obviously, I started Vital Transformation. We did a lot of our work in Belgium. I started the company 2012, so 14 years ago. It was really interesting. We were doing a lot of work around the Gastein Health Conference, and what we found was a lot of the activist organizations, a lot of the funding that was coming to attack pricing, access, a lot of the more militant aspects around the pharmaceutical sector. You were dealing with European organizations, but when you actually looked at it and you actually analyzed the funding, it was a lot of U.S.-based dark money political action groups that were actually funding a lot of this stuff in Europe. What seems to have been happening recently here in the United States is a lot of that money's been coming here. How do you think that these things are going to start impacting access here in the United States now that we're having these sort of European strategies to pricing rolling out across the United States?
Well, I think that, within the U.S., we're obviously looking towards ex-U.S., environments. We're looking to see how things are shaping up in terms of innovation and how funding for innovation is actually shaping up. In the U.S., we're certainly focused on trying to drive innovation as much as possible and having the right incentives in place to actually set up that level of innovation. We need to essentially see an environment where innovation is still very much the focus of the U.S. economy. And that helps drive, I would say, to some degree, the level of funding and then the focus of that funding on the pharmaceutical industry.
Do you think there was a level of complacency from the industry about the possibility of getting, smacked in the teeth around some of these pricing issues?
I would say that I think it was something that was to some degree expected, but at the same time, knowing what we know in terms of what it takes, in terms of the size of the investment that it takes to bring about innovation in the U.S., and given all the different regulatory hurdles that we have to face in order to bring something to market, and then essentially drive access to innovation for U.S. patients, I think it's something that we knew full well, but at the same time, maybe we're not as quick to put the right parameters or criteria in place for us to react accordingly.
If you look back to the prescription drug benefit, Medicare Part D, there was a real belief that the U.S. needed to lead biopharmaceutical sectors. We needed to be the global leader. Europe in 1980 had 60% of the innovation. Now it's the United States. Do you think that there's been just a change politically, that there's not this belief that there needs to be this collaboration between government and industry?
I don't think so. I think that the current administration is very focused on that. I think to some degree, there's been this big push to have more governmental involvement in some of that innovation. I mean, I think the sharing of intellectual property and kind of that focus on innovation between some of the government agencies and the private industry is still there. I think, again, it goes back to the appropriate incentives.
Right.
How do you set up the right infrastructure in the U.S. to drive a clear, pro-innovation agenda? And without that, I think it's very difficult to try to overcome some of the ex-U.S. involvement in the innovative space.
No, we've just alluded to a recent study that you've funded. What was interesting about the preprint, which we just published, and if people want to see it, you can come to our website, vitaltransformation.com. We just literally came live 3 days ago. One of the core findings that we found in the study was when you looked at before and after the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, we're seeing very large impacts, particularly in oncology. Again, we're at ASCO. This is really very topical.
Yep.
We're seeing a 35% reduction in follow-on research, and we're seeing, I guess, which came as quite a surprise to us, a 27% reduction in lead assets in small molecule oncology. Now, we'd anticipated that small molecule oncology would be the area that would have a high exposure to IRA. Were you surprised at Sanofi with those results? Is that what you were anticipating when you asked us to do this work?
You know, it's interesting because we had suspicions.
Yeah.
We wanted to understand the impact of what we call the pill penalty, or the disadvantaging of the small molecules in terms of drug selection for Medicare negotiation as compared to, their biological brethren. The issue was we wanted to get some level of evidence to help validate our suspicions. And I think that this particular study and this research to understand not just, the impact on small molecule investment and innovation, but then also all the work that you guys have done to look at all the post-market impact that I think is very, very important, because much of the innovation comes from the life cycle of the medicine even after it gets to market, which is really, really important, especially in orphan drugs or rare diseases or in oncology in particular. So we wanted to kind of bring this to ASCO. We wanted to bring this more to the general public and really get a sense of how do we actually add some evidence to help support some of our initial understanding and claims.
What was really interesting is, the entire pipeline for the post-approval research was heavily weighted to oncology, 54%.
Yep.
It's been such a dominant part of the research pipeline globally for the entire sector. And when you look at those lead indications, that 27% drop, there's 4.7 on average studies post-approval for every lead indication.
Yep.
And so it's axiomatic. When you drop the lead indications, of course, you end up with a drop in follow-on studies. Do you think there's going to be a grudging acceptance on the Hill, some of the regulators, that, wait, maybe we went too far here? I know that we obviously had a big disagreement with the CBO on this. I hate to say it, we're being proven right.
Yeah.
Do you think that the politicians now are getting hip to the fact that, we might have broke it?
The bigger the body of evidence to help substantiate some of that may bring a little bit of, hopefully, understanding to those that are involved. Certainly, I think it's important to continue to kind of bang on CBO's door to help them understand and kind of change their assumptions to some degree. And then also, show that clear picture where you have a downward slope of investment and bringing innovation to market as a result of all this change. And again, it's still relatively early in the IRA's implementation and effectuation. We're just, we're at IPAY 2026 at this point.
Right.
And so we still have a couple more years, but I think eventually people are going to see that there's going to be this continuous decrease in investment funding, and then obviously less products for patients to take advantage of in the years to come.
If you read a lot of the quote-unquote smart people who were writing about this 3 or 4 years ago, there was a general belief that, this is pandemic, this is interest rates. There were a lot of hemming and hawing about, no, this is not a real drop. What's fascinating, when you look at the cohort that we did a balanced cohort 4 years before, 4 years after.
Yeah.
The second worst year after IRA was implemented was 2025 last year. That was the second lowest in the pipeline. That should give people pause. What does that say, given the fact that oncology had the second worst year after IRA in 2025, when everything was supposed to be recovering and supposed to be hunky-dory? What does that say about the indication selection that the industry is doing late stage now?
People are starting to take second looks at what their portfolio looks like, because they're seeing that there's a strong disincentive to bring products to market, not because they're not trying to solve for people's unmet needs. The issue is that it takes a heavy level of investment to actually bring a product to market. It takes a significant amount of time. We're talking north of $2 billion and north of 10 years in some cases.
Yeah.
And therefore, you need to have the appropriate life cycle for certain products to actually make a difference. And that is not just in the oncology space, but it's across all the different therapeutic areas. Oncology, given that it's small molecule, heavily focused, I think that's where you see the disproportionate effect as a result. So,
and it's also money, because the IRA, when you'd run the numbers, depending on the asset and the time to market and the size of the study, essentially that 9-year pill penalty is somewhere between 40 or 60% of the profit goes away. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on the incentives and the ability to bring those assets to market. Let's talk a bit about the patients then. What are some of the heavy implications now for patients that we're seeing, 27% drop in lead assets in oncology small molecules, 35% drop in follow-on studies in oncology small molecules. What is this telling patients? What are the implications?
I think it's pretty clear you have less access to innovative products. You have less options in terms of what you can actually use to help treat your particular disease, and especially in the oncology space where you're talking about extending someone's life, you're talking about life and death. And so at the opportunity to actually bring more innovative products to market and then have that hindered as a result of some of this intervention, you really have to question kind of the motivation around this. Beyond just patient access to innovative products, there's also kind of the misnomer around affordability. At some point, patients may see some changes as a result of their benefit plans, in terms of changes to their affordability and their benefit plan designs. But at the same time, overall, the products are actually at times more expensive. So you kind of wonder, like, what's actually motivating this further intervention to try to get more products under negotiation.
One of the other things that's been occurring now is discussions around the Orphan Cures Act that was incorporated into the Big Beautiful Bill. Because one of the other findings in this study is we see that orphan oncology is also statistically significantly declining relative to a lot of the other assets. How important was the Orphan Cures Act inclusion in that?
Very important. You're no longer just focused on just a single orphan designation for a particular product. You actually have the opportunity to do post-market research, develop additional indications as a result of that. The Orphan Cures provision of the One Big Beautiful Bill is a clear step in the right direction to actually help improve patients to get access to drugs that provide a treatment for rare disease and so on and so forth.
Now, CBO recently released a reanalysis of the Orphan Cures Act, and the initial price tag was about $5 billion. That's gone up about 50% now. And they released a study saying, given the inclusions that have come in and some of the exemptions that are now assumed to the administration and how drugs that have been thrown in the pot here for the Orphan Cures Act, this is going to be quite a bit more expensive. Now, there's some members of Congress that are starting to reintroduce legislation to say, well, actually, we want to get rid of this. This is getting too expensive. We got to price it. This isn't working, so they're going to try and repeal it. What do you think the impact would be if that gets repealed?
Again, we're thinking about the standpoint of what is the impact on patient access to innovative products, especially in cases where there's less of an incentive for manufacturers to actually get into the orphan space or into the rare disease space where there are clear unmet needs. And if you take away the appropriate incentives for actually not being subject to negotiation for certain orphan indicated products, there'll be less products that are going to be innovated. There are going to be less products that are actually going to be brought to market, and then patients are going to end up losing out because at some point you're going to realize that not trying to meet those patient unmet needs is really going to be a problem for patients, providers, and the opportunity to actually address some of the other downstream costs in the healthcare system. As more patients have, I would say, higher cost therapies or higher cost, care regimens associated with rare diseases, if there's any opportunity to address that early on in the patient journey, I think it's important.
There was a world before orphan legislation.
That's right.
And the reason why the legislation was put in was because basically it wasn't economically viable without the provisions of the orphan drug legislation. I think a lot of people don't understand that most oncology is really small. We were just discussing before we came and started the podcast, if you go back and look at something like acute lymphoblastic leukemia, one of the first targets for CAR T, you're talking 400-500 patients a year. And these are really small indications. Is it still economically viable without, an orphan-free pass, as it were, to go after those targets? I mean, would those then start to be neglected, do you think?
From an innovation standpoint and an incentive standpoint, without having the appropriate pathways involved and those kind of protections, I would say, for manufacturers, it becomes less likely. Right, and I'm not speaking for us in terms of what we do and how we invest our dollars into our research and R&D space and development and so on. I'm thinking just in terms of the overall health system and how manufacturers consider prioritizing what they decide that they want to get involved in terms of R&D.
If you look at a lot of the drugs now that have gone generic that are off-label, there's some extremely effective drugs for lymphoma and leukemia that are now, generic. I think about the generic rituximabs and things like that that are very effective, and they're essentially borderline free now.
Yep.
If you're a drug manufacturer, why would you try and address something that has a 60-70% cure rate? Of course you're going to want to look at the metastatic late stage 4. I mean, that's where the ultimate need is, and by definition, that's going to be a much smaller population. Do you think that there's getting to be a lack of understanding of how this actual pathway really works?
The focus of a lot of manufacturers, given the kind of the advancement in technology, given the advancement in the focus of where they can actually treat disease, it's a bit of a focus on precision.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of the driving effort, right? How do you solve for that?
But the regulators are pushing back on those late stages.
I agree. I'm not exactly sure why. At the same time, I think there's a little bit of a misaligned incentive there.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, why would you want to go after something that has a 70% cure rate and is free?
I agree, to me, it's a big conundrum, and we're trying to figure out how to best solve for it.
So if we look back at our first study where we looked at the early stage, I mean the really early stuff, Angel, VC, phase 1, phase 2, our first IRA analysis, we really picked up this indication by indication analysis where the VCs were being pretty clever, and they were saying, okay, this oncology drug hits about 40, 45 years old. We'll invest in this one. We'll take a punt on this. But then if you saw it going into, prostate and some stuff that was much later, way into the Medicare age population, VCs and angels were just like not touching it with a barge pole.
Right.
What's really interesting about the study we did for you folks in the industry side, where you're doing the phase 3s, you're really just like, nope, don't want small molecules. Kirsten Axelson, we're on a panel at AshCon in 2 weeks in Minneapolis talking about this study and another study we've done on MFN. And she says she's been talking to a lot of folks in the industry, and they're just saying, yeah, small molecules now are just kind of icky. That's how they're describing it. I mean, do you think that's what's happening? It's just, we just don't want to mess with it anymore?
I think it's the fact that there's such a tremendous fail rate. If the incentives are there, then yes, you may still have a kind of a focus on small molecule, but investment and innovation. The issue is, if the fail rate is going to be so high, and you're only seeing maybe 9 to 10% of all products actually coming to market, then what's really driving that? What is the appropriate mechanism to prioritize where you're actually focusing your funding and your how you deploy your resources against the appropriate pipeline assets?
Small molecules have a real need in certain areas, particularly solid tumors. The last Nobel Prize 3 years ago was awarded to a medicinal chemistry company in San Diego. We were sort of moving into a revolution in medicinal chemistry and small molecules, and now we disincentivized them. What are the impacts if we start moving away from small molecules broadly?
It's interesting because I think there's also a misunderstanding that it's more difficult to develop biologics. I think it's relatively, on par in terms of how do you discover and develop therapies on the small molecule side as well as biologics. I think the issue is that you'll see certain therapeutic areas that ultimately get disadvantaged. We've talked about oncology being one. You have mental health, which is another one. It's just something that we were focused on in my previous company. Biologics don't cross the blood-brain barrier.
Right.
So you have a strong disincentive for patients that would see less likely available products on market. And again, that goes back to the whole options to actually bring available medications that can treat a more precise target for a particular disease state.
Also, it's just the practicality of when a small molecule goes generic. The price immediately drops to basically zero, and you can carry them around for 6 months in a jar, and you don't have to go visit your doctor.
But at the same time, even in the biologic space, we have so many challenges, I would say, coming with the biosimilars space in terms of uptake. How do you kind of address that? I mean, I think that's the other piece that we don't necessarily consider is that small molecules and biosimilars often face very difficult challenges when it comes to trying to penetrate, but until they reach that point where their price drops precipitously over that period of time.
So we've been talking quite a lot about our study for obvious reasons. We're here at ASCO, Inflation Reduction Act. However, there's also most favored nations out there in the ether. which is an executive order that says you must put a price in the market based on the basket of OECD countries, and then the U.S. taxpayer and all the Medicare and Medicaid programs are going to get that same price. What is going to happen with a most favored nation implementation from the standpoint of patient access? Where do you see this going?
Not exactly sure that most favored nations will actually benefit patients directly. I mean, there's probably been some aspects of it around, direct to patient, availability through various platforms that I won't talk about. And then also there's probably been some level of negotiation where we see with GLP-1s and so on and so forth. But at the same time, the majority of patients in the U.S., they get their pharmacy benefit through their employer.
Yeah.
I doubt that will actually change that drastically over a period of time. We're certainly thinking about how do we navigate this post-MFN environment in many ways. And what does this mean in terms of our ability to actually bring products to market in the U.S. as well as outside the U.S.?
Politically, it sounds on the surface quite innocuous and sounds great. I think from a purely red meat local political perspective, hey, I want the same price that other people are getting. I mean, it's a really tough one because it has so much tractability from a bumper sticker standpoint, I guess. Unfortunately, the pharmaceutical sector operates increasingly like Hollywood, where one blockbuster funds most of the activity of a studio for the whole year. That's a similar situation. And if you're only attacking the pricing on the blockbusters, you're not going to get much activity across the studio. Is there an understanding here about what potentially could happen to the entire sector? You're not just attacking certain prices, you're really killing R&D broadly across the whole sector?
There's been a lot of research and analysis around that particular space, very similar to what was done with the IRA. And I think the cooling of innovation and the availability of new products coming to market will be evident. I think it's something that we really have to think about. And at the same time, how much does that impact, U.S. innovation as compared to, where the U.S. sits within the global sector?
Right.
In terms of are we looking to, potentially see other front runners in the innovative space, especially in the pharmaceutical and health life sciences, sectors.
If we go back and look at the sector in 1980, I alluded to this earlier, 60% of the medicines were invented in Europe. The U.S. was something of an also-ran.
Yeah.
Then the prescription drug benefit gets passed. The European Union moves to the centralized procedure, moves away from national regulators choosing the drugs and goes to a centralized procedure. So it moves away from the regulator working with the clinician in clinical trials to basically bureaucratic processes with people who are basically governmental officials, not necessarily clinicians. We see Europe starting to drop. The U.S. then comes up, and now we're doing 60%. One of our last studies, we saw Europe doing less than 20% of the assets in our portfolio when we analyzed all the intellectual property. Meanwhile, we've analyzed globally U.S., Europe, and Chinese registered clinical trials with the FDA. As of last year, 2025, Chinese-led companies registering trials with FDA exceeded European companies.
Yep.
And at current trends, by 2028, China may exceed the U.S.
We're essentially accelerating that process.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the MFN has those, I would say, unintended consequences, or maybe they are intended consequences.
Exactly.
We have to be very mindful of that dynamic. I think that it's interesting to see what we're hearing on Capitol Hill, where there's this strong, U.S. competitiveness discussion happening with the likes of China and other markets in across the globe. But at the same time, we're imposing specific policy ideas or concepts here in the U.S. that could exacerbate the problem.
Yeah.
And that's something that we need to really kind of bring to light in our discussions with policymakers and others.
I had a conversation with Robert Coughlin, who was the head of Mass Bio, deputy governor of the state of Massachusetts for many years. An old school political operator. I mean, the ultimate Boston guy. He's now working for Jones Lang LaSalle, in their biotech leasing space. He's got millions and millions and millions of square cubic feet of unleased laboratory space in Massachusetts. I've had several conversations with members of Congress. They're very concerned about the loss of biotech startups in Massachusetts. I just did a podcast with the folks at Biocom in San Diego. Mm-hmm. They've got a 14-story tower that they've been built. They're doing research. It's not leased.
Yeah.
there are real tangible problems here. IRA and MFN are supposed to be America first. The numbers are starting to say, no, there is a real problem here. Do the people you talk to on the Hill understand that?
I personally don't talk to people on the Hill. But I know members of our government relations team, they do a fantastic job of trying to educate members of Congress, this dialogue of, what it means to operate in this particular system, and then what it means to actually have patients impacted by what you do, how you innovate, and how you bring products to market. I'm hoping that policymakers and the like are able to see that as you think about some of these policies in concept, you have to consider the unintended consequences that come with them. If you want to have a very highly innovative infrastructure in the U.S., you have to focus on the incentives.
Where do you think we're going to be in 3 to 5 years right now?
To some degree, I think we're going to be in a good place in the sense that as an industry, we're still going to have our motivation be the patients. We're going to try to continue to drive innovation as best as we can. Are we going to be in a tighter environment where more regulatory interventions, more legislative interventions may come about? We're already in a place where, again, it takes us a long time to actually bring products to market, but at the same time, if we have further challenges, further hurdles that we have to, I would say, navigate, then we're going to have to think about other markets. And the idea here is that, if we're going to capitalize our innovation in the U.S., we're going to innovate in the U.S., we're going to do R&D and our development, our delivery in the U.S., but now we don't have the appropriate infrastructure here, then we have to think about other markets because science will win at the end of the day, and we'll have to continue to make patients our primary mission in trying to meet those unmet needs.
When New York was going bankrupt, the CEO of Citibank said capital goes to where it's most loved.
I hate to think about things in terms of dollars and cents, but in order to really bring about the meaningful changes and kind of life-changing experiences and therapies to patients, and then also kind of equip and empower providers to make those meaningful changes in patients' lives, you have to invest in the appropriate therapies that can drive that meaningful change.
The Inflation Reduction Act's impact on late-stage R&D is available for download in preprint form on our website, vitaltransformation.com. It was funded in part by Michael Penn and Sanofi. Michael, thank you very much. It's been wonderful speaking to you.
Thank you, Dwayne, and thank you to ASCO for making this conference happen, and we're certainly looking forward to participating as much as we can.
All the best. Talk to you in a bit.
Thanks.
The executive producer of the Vital Health Podcast is Dwayne Schultes. Editing by Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation LLC, copyright 2026.